"Somebody get the old man out of the way, the general's here." That's what one recruit whispered when a 70-year-old janitor in bleach-stained coveralls stepped forward in a room full of trained soldiers. A decorated 3-star general had just raised his hand in a salute that not a single recruit in that building could return. They fumbled. They froze. They had no idea what they were even looking at. But that old janitor, the one they called Pops, the one they looked through every single morning like he was part of the furniture, he set down his mop, walked to the centre of the room, and returned that salute with a precision so sharp that the general's eyes filled with tears. Not one person in that room knew they had been walking past a legend for 11 years. If this story moves you, comment "honour" below before we begin. His name was Arthur Deming, and for the last 11 years he had mopped the floors of Fort Rigby without a single person knowing who he really was. He arrived every morning at 4:30, long before the recruits stumbled out of their bunks. He swept hallways. He cleaned latrines. He polished brass fixtures that no one but him ever noticed were tarnished. The younger soldiers barely looked at him. When they did, they saw exactly what they expected to see. An old man in coveralls pushing a mop bucket. Some of them called him Pops. A few of the less kind ones didn't call him anything at all. They looked through him like he was part of the furniture. Arthur never corrected them. He never told them his last name. He never told them anything about where he had been or what he had done. He just showed up, did his work, and went home to a small apartment off base where he lived alone with a cat named Bishop and a folded flag in a glass case on the mantel. The general's visit had been planned for weeks. Lieutenant General Marcus Hale was conducting an inspection tour of regional training facilities, and Fort Rigby was on his list. The base commander, Colonel Weathers, had the recruits drilled and polished and standing at perfect attention an hour before the motorcade arrived. Everything was supposed to go smoothly. The general would inspect the formation, address the recruits, tour the grounds, and leave. But Marcus Hale was not the type of officer who followed a script. He never had been. When he stepped into the training hall, he didn't begin with a speech. He didn't shake hands with Colonel Weathers first. He walked straight to the centre of the room, faced the recruits, and raised his right hand in a salute that made Colonel Weathers blink twice. It wasn't the standard modern military salute. It was a legacy field salute, a variation used by a very specific unit during a very specific era of combat operations that most of these young men and women had only read about in history briefs, if they had read about it at all. The room went silent. The recruits looked at each other. A few of them raised their hands in confused half-salutes. One private brought his hand up too fast and clipped his own brow. Another held the position at the wrong angle entirely. The drill sergeant standing off to the side looked uncomfortable. Colonel Weathers opened his mouth to intervene, to explain, perhaps, or to redirect the moment, but the general held up one finger without turning around. He wasn't interested in explanations. He was watching, waiting. He held that salute for 10 seconds, 15, 20. The silence became unbearable. Some recruits dropped their hands, others kept trying but knew they were wrong. And then a voice came from the back of the room. Not loud, not dramatic, just calm and clear. "Permission to approach, sir." Every head turned. Arthur Deming stood near the supply closet door with his mop still dripping onto the tile behind him. His coveralls had a bleach stain on the left knee. His boots were old but clean. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked forward, his steps unhurried but deliberate, with a posture that straightened with every stride until by the time he reached the centre of the room, he didn't look like a janitor anymore. He looked like something else entirely. He stopped 3 paces from the general, squared his shoulders, and returned the salute with a precision that made several recruits inhale sharply. The angle was exact. The hand placement was exact. The timing was exact. Lieutenant General Hale stared at him for a long moment. Then he lowered his salute, and his jaw tightened with an emotion that wasn't part of any inspection protocol. "Sergeant Major Deming," the general said quietly. The title landed in the room like a thunderclap. Colonel Weathers took a step back. The drill sergeant's mouth fell open. The recruits didn't move. Arthur said nothing for a moment. Then he replied, just as quietly, "It's been a long time, Captain." The general let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 30 years. He stepped forward and extended his hand, and when Arthur took it, Hale pulled him into an embrace that no one in that room had ever seen a 3-star general give anyone, let alone a man in maintenance coveralls. "I looked for you," Hale said. "After I made colonel, after I made general, I tried to find you. They told me you disappeared. Arthur shrugged. I didn't disappear. I just stopped being loud about it. What the recruits learned in the next 5 minutes changed how many of them understood the word service. Lieutenant General Hale turned to the room and told them that the man standing beside him had been one of the most respected sergeant majors in the history of the 75th Ranger Regiment. That Arthur Deming had completed 7 combat deployments across 3 decades, that he had been awarded the Silver Star twice, the Bronze Star with Valor, and a Purple Heart after pulling 2 wounded men from an overturned vehicle under direct fire in a province whose name most of these recruits couldn't spell. He told them that the salute he had just demonstrated was one that Deming himself had taught him, when Hale was a 23-year-old junior officer who didn't know how to lead and was terrified every day. This man made me into the officer I became, Hale said, and you walked past him every day without knowing it. No one spoke. A few of the recruits who had called him Pop stared at the floor. One private in the front row was crying and didn't bother to wipe his face. Colonel Weathers approached Arthur and extended his hand, but Arthur was already looking past him, at the youngest recruit in the formation, a kid who couldn't have been older than 19 and who was shaking slightly. Arthur walked over to him. You tried to return it, he said. Your angle was off, but you tried. That counts. The kid straightened up. Sergeant Major, I didn't know. Arthur put a hand on his shoulder. You're not supposed to know everything on day 1. That's the whole point of being here. Then he looked around the room. That goes for all of you. In the weeks that followed, things changed at Fort Rigby. Colonel Weathers submitted a formal recommendation that Sergeant Major Deming be invited to serve as a ceremonial advisor and mentor for incoming recruit classes, and Arthur accepted on the condition that he could still mop the floors in the mornings, because he said the quiet helped him think. The recruits began stopping by his supply closet not to ask about war stories, though he had them, but to ask about discipline, about fear, about what it meant to serve when no one was watching. Arthur answered every question the same way he did everything else, simply, directly. It wasn't necessary. They did it anyway, it wasn't necessary, they did it anyway. Lieutenant General Hale returned to Fort Rigby one more time before his retirement tour concluded. He found Arthur in the training hall early in the morning, mopping the floor before anyone else had arrived. Hale stood in the doorway and watched for a moment. Then he raised his hand in the same salute. Arthur looked up, set the mop aside, and returned it. No words this time, just 2 men, and 30 years of shared understanding passing between them in a gesture that took less than 3 seconds but carried the weight of everything they had survived. Hale nodded once, turned, and left. Arthur picked up the mop and went back to work. There are people walking among us every single day whose stories would bring us to our knees if we knew them. They don't wear their medals. They don't announce their rank. They clean our floors and bag our groceries and sit quietly on park benches, and we pass them without a second glance because we have decided, based on nothing but what we can see, that we already know who they are. Arthur Deming served his country for 30 years, and then served it again for 11 more in silence, never asking for recognition, never demanding respect, just doing the work that was in front of him. That is what honour looks like when no one is watching. If you believe that kind of story deserves to be heard, subscribe to this channel so you never miss another one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today.